Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Ada for the third webinar in our series, Exploring the 10 Years Beyond Bushfires Report, Social Networks and Disaster Resilience. My name is Amanda Leck. I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's webinar. Before I begin, I wish to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing connections to cultures and to the lands and waters of Australia. I will introduce our speakers shortly, but before I do, I'd like to provide you with some brief housekeeping notes. Today's event will be recorded and made available after the event. Today, we will be using the Q&A feature on Zoom to take questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat window. You'll be able to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and I will do my best to ask a number of those questions to our speakers following their presentations. I encourage you to use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentations, and just a reminder that you will need to select all panellists and attendees in the drop-down menu for everyone attending today to view your messages. I would also like to remind you to please be respectful to each other and our presenters when posting your comments or questions. Please join me now in welcoming our first speaker for today, Dr. Colin Gallagher from the Child and Community Wellbeing Unit, Centre for Health Equity at the University of Melbourne. Dr. Colin Gallagher is a research fellow in social network analysis in the Centre for Health Equity at the University of Melbourne School of Population and Global Health, as well as a member of MELNET, the Social Networks Laboratory of Melbourne and Swinburne Universities. His primary interests lie in how social networks within disaster-affected communities contribute to social capital, resilience, and wellbeing. His current work focuses on how person-to-person social relationships influence post-traumatic mental health and wellbeing, and the role of local community groups in recovery processes. Over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Amanda. So today I'll be building on so again, my name is Colin Gallagher, a social network researcher at the University of Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. Next slide. Today I'll be building on a series of talks stemming from the 10 Years Beyond Bushfires project. This is a longitudinal mixed methods study looking at individual and community responses to the Black Saturday bushfires of 2009. So you may have seen my colleagues in a range of prior talks on the topics in this forum related, speaking on topics related to mental health and well-being. Today, I'll be going into further depth on one major component of this research, looking at social relationships and how they impact mental health in the wake of a disaster. Next slide, please. So it's beyond obvious that social relationships are central to mental health and well-being and for every functioning in everyday life, and that they come under new strains and pressures in the wake of a major disaster. In the face of this, maintaining or establishing new social connectedness is often emphasized as a key ingredient to recovery, at least for most people. But it's equally obvious, I think, that the role of social relationships is actually more complicated than that. So while we know that for most people, having some kind of social connection is better than none at all, it gets more complex. Next slide. That picture gets particularly complicated when we think about what happens in the context of a disaster. Disasters don't just traumatize the individual mind, they also disrupt systems, social systems, economic systems, infrastructural systems, and potentially environmental systems. When we think of the prototypical natural disaster, such as a bushfire or a hurricane or an earthquake, we think of them affecting groups of people who live near one another, interact frequently, and depend on one another for many of their everyday needs. This creates a complex picture because it creates a situation where help givers are often help seekers themselves. And this underpins the view of a disaster as an inherently collective event in which a social system experiences shared trauma, shared losses, and a basic disruption to its social fabric. Next slide, please. At the same time, this interdependence that binds a community together in large part shapes the degree to which it can absorb or adapt in the face of a major shock or disruption. Here we're interested in what it is about the overall makeup of the community and its connections that help to make it resilient in a way that you can't predict based solely on just who the individuals are in that community. So we're generally interested in resilience as, which you have often heard of as the whole being more than the sum of its parts. And the idea that people are resilient together, not merely they're not resilient in similar ways in isolation. But these are only vague guiding statements, and then actually unpacking these collective processes behind real resilience can be difficult. Next slide, please. So when we turn to the question about how relationships matter, we have to ask a bunch of additional questions. What types of relationships? How many? In what context? What are they good for exactly? Mental health or some other idea of performance or well-being? Are these relationships good for everyone involved, or is the benefit one-sided? Are there any negative trade-offs to the relationships we're talking about? And how might there be wider ramifications beyond the two people involved in the relationship themselves? Next slide. So to give a really simple example of the kind of these additive effects of relationships at a community level, here's a fun and interesting example, and that's slime molds. This is one of my favorite studies, I think. Slime molds are really interesting creatures from a network standpoint in that they kind of operate by fanning out. They look for food, and when they find pockets of nutrients, they start forming channels or tubes to funnel those nutrients around the whole organism. In this study, Japanese researchers configured oat flakes in the same position as major population centers around the Tokyo area and found that the slime molds did a really remarkable job of creating nutrient networks that resembled the actual railway lines between population centers. Next slide, please. And amazingly, this leads to some really neat and really useful properties that can only be seen when we take this overall viewpoint on the system as a whole, and it's take into account the connections that are part of this system. In particular, these networks were highly redundant, meaning that there were no easy cut points in this network at which you could really easily split the network in two. And anytime one link is cut, the nutrients could easily flow over other tubes in the network. And you think about that, that's also a good thing for rail networks in an earthquake-prone country. And it's amazing because the slime mold isn't a smart creature. It doesn't have a central brain that helps it to figure out this ideal network configuration. It's only doing this through some simple rules that have to do with flow and pressure around the oat flakes. Yet it creates this remarkable wider system. So this is just a simple example of how through a few local properties or local principles, you can have these remarkable wider community-wide properties that we might speak of in terms of resilience. Next slide, please. Now, if only humans were so simple as slime molds. The trick is humans aren't connected through slime tubes. They have many different potential types of relationships: kinships, marriages, friendships, co-working relationships, all of which can transmit both good and bad things like social support, information, advice, but also obligations and negative information. On top of that, we can have different feelings about people, liking or disliking, trust, negative ties such as conflict and tension. Next slide. And so a useful tool for analyzing all of these connections in combination falls to social network analysis, or SNA. So you might already have a pretty good intuition for what SNA is, but there are some important aspects to keep in mind. Here we're interested in picking apart these specific relationships in detail by focusing on crucial combinations of relationships. We're not just looking at all connections of any kind. We're looking at specific types of connections, such as social support, trust, advice, however it might be defined. Notably, these methods are typically applied to people as we do today in the Beyond Bushfires study, but we can think about connections more broadly existing between organizations or countries. We can even think of non-human entities, such as animals and species, as we'll see in Michele's talk later, or even things like websites or biological proteins. Next slide, please. But in the Beyond Bushfires study, we are most interested in social support networks between people and the potential buffering effects that these have for well-being. Next slide, please. In the Beyond Bushfires study, the results we present here today pertain mostly to emotionally close relationships. So who do you feel personally close to? So an idea of socio-emotional social support. So in the Beyond Bushfires study, over the course of 3 different waves, we sampled very deeply into these affected communities, reaching out systematically to everyone in certain pockets of bushfire affected areas. We asked our survey respondents to name other people they go to for certain types of social support, in this case, emotional closeness. So who do you feel personally close to? We also looked at relationships of practical assistance, but again, the results here are emotional closeness. This allowed us to create network maps like you see here, in which people can nominate others, but they can also be nominated by others. They might occupy certain positions in this overall network as well, such as central positions or positions at the edge. And we can analyze these maps, both by looking at them, but more specifically through statistical models that can pick out certain patterns or tendencies within these networks. And we can relate those tendencies to mental health and well-being. Next slide, please. So with respect to depression symptoms in particular, our findings center around outgoing ties. So the act of, say, me nominating other people to whom I feel close. And what we've found, if we can go back a slide, what we found is that feeling close to others predicts less depression. This is analogous to social support. The closer you feel to other people, the less mental health issues you're likely to face. Ooh, I think we're having some difficulties. I'll just speak through that. But if we can go to the next slide, there were exceptions to this outgoing pattern. And that was if you were connected to, if you nominated someone who'd left the community, for instance, you would experience, this predicted a greater likelihood of depression. This relates potentially to the loss of social support. So if I feel closer to somebody who left the community, then I was at greater risk of depression. Next slide, please. Another exception to this outgoing tie pattern was if I nominated someone who themselves was depressed. So we found that depression co-occurred across social ties. So this could indicate a few different things going on. Perhaps people prone to depression like to hang out with one another, but it could also be a social influence pattern whereby depression could potentially spread over close ties. Apologies for the slides. Next slide, please. With respect to PTSD, we found a different pattern for incoming ties, where a different pattern that pertained to incoming ties, not outgoing ties. So here, fewer incoming ties was associated with greater risk of PTSD. So one interpretation is that this is associated with an avoidance function of PTSD, whereby people with PTSD tend to avoid people and places associated with the trauma. Excuse me. So here, there may be a loss of social support over time. Okay, next slide, please. But again, an exception to this pattern was when it came in the context of rising property damage. So what happened here is that as people are nominated by others with higher property loss, their likelihood of PTSD goes up. So put another way, as my own property loss goes up as an individual, the people to whom I'm connected through close social ties are likelier to have PTSD. Again, there's a lot of caution to be had in terms of interpreting the causality behind these patterns, but they do raise important issues for further investigation. Okay, next slide. Another way we looked at social connection was in terms of involvement in local clubs and groups like sports clubs, service clubs, arts and crafts, and the like. Next slide. In this way, we're able to consider a different form of social connection through the activities you engage in. So these kinds of co-affiliation networks, whereby people aren't necessarily connected directly, or at least represented as that, but they're represented as having connections through what they do. Next slide, please. So our results pertain mostly to PTSD, where we found a particularly interesting set of results around the level of involvement, measured in terms of the number of involvements. So to begin with, 45% of the sample did not participate in any local group. And we found that these individuals were at a higher risk of PTSD. Next slide. With increasing levels of participation came decreasing risk of PTSD. At one group, next slide, and at two groups where we saw the most benefit on average. Next slide. However, this benefit on average seemed to top out at around 3 groups and above, and even started to decline, with over-involved people experiencing increased risk of PTSD. Next slide. Importantly, this effect did not just pertain to individuals. We saw an additional community-wide pattern where it mattered how balanced or equitable the overall distribution of group involvements was. So in communities where group participation was imbalanced or skewed towards just a few individuals, we saw increased risk of PTSD related simply to residing into these imbalanced communities, regardless of what you yourself was doing in terms of group participation. Next slide, please. A better situation was found when people shared the load by participating to some degree in more than one group. So importantly, where we saw most people participating to some degree. Importantly, this was a community-wide effect, once again. So simply by being in one of these decentralized or equitably structured community, this was a buoy to mental health. Next slide. So in terms of practical importance, what do we do? What do we see? What should be done to support mental health? Well, we can offer a few suggestions or potential avenues of investigation. For the under-involved, the answer seems relatively straightforward, and that could be to support nearly half of the population who aren't involved to get involved. Speculatively, this would serve as some form of behavioral activation in which people have the opportunity to get moving, to get active, and enjoy the mental health benefits that come from that. Next slide. However, a word of caution is that might not be a good idea simply to foster the creation of new groups. If what you end up doing is simply spurring more involvement by the over-involved. So if you simply create new groups, people who are good at belonging to groups might just join more groups. Some people are just participators, and if what you're doing is simply putting another thing on their plate to do, you might actually be doing the opposite to what you intended. So really the point here is to target the under-involved specifically and see what might support their participation in the local community. Next slide. On the flip side of the coin, what can we do for those who are over-involved? Well, you might think that encouraging them to reduce their load might be a good idea, but that might come with a tricky trade-off. Shedding group responsibilities might be personally helpful for the over-involved individual, but it's important to keep in mind that this might create a void in the community whereby they're participating in a group and their participation in that group keeps that group running. So if they withdraw from a lot of groups, that might hurt the groups they're a part of. And if those groups have people that really rely on that group, that might have a negative wider effect. So one of the most poignant personal anecdotes I have from the Beyond Bushfires study is where I was in a bushfire affected community and visiting a community breakfast. And in an aside during a conversation, the leader of that breakfast, who was pushing 80 probably at the time, said, you know, I'd love to hand over the reins to this group, but there's nobody to replace me. And if I go, this group stops, and these people who rely on this group have nowhere else to go. So a key ingredient here might not be having people withdraw participation, but providing additional support for groups and those who lead them, and to help things like leadership succession. So next slide. What else can be done? Well, if you're, say, working in local government and dealing with data collection strategies, one idea might be to start with simply measuring group involvement. It's relatively easy to do. Just simply ask people which groups they're involved in. We think it's meaningful based on the effects and findings we presented here today. It also serves as a potential map for engagement. It not only helps you figure out what are the popular groups that everyone belongs to, but it also helps you identify which groups tend to be people's only involvement. So if you ask a bunch of people, which groups are you involved in? Do you see some people saying, my one and only group is the footy club, or it's the church, or something like that? Just remember that the distribution here is the key. We're looking for widespread involvement by a lot of people. Next slide, please. So taken together, these results add up to a picture of socially resilient communities where social support ties have withstood trauma and disruption through various means, and where their benefits outweigh the potential downsides that may come with social ties, such as being witness to other mental health issues or dealing with people who move away and the loss that happens with that. Meanwhile, group involvement in resilient communities may tend to be a picture of more balance across the community as a whole, with most people chipping in at least to some degree. Okay, next slide. So as a final point, we've talked a lot here about social connections and their importance for mental health. And often in disasters, we think about a lot of other types of connections, like economic connections or physical connections in transport and other forms of infrastructure. However, the idea of a social network can be extended to other types of connection, such as ecological connection or connections to nature. So in our own work, we have found suggestions of the importance of people's connection to nature and the benefit that that can have for mental health. So I think it's a really interesting, hopefully it's a really interesting extension to be followed up by Michele in a moment here, who's going to talk more generally about connections between the social and the ecological and how these two things can work together to portray an idea of resilience. Next slide. So thank you. If you're interested in these results, please have a visit to our webpage. The link will also be posted in the chat. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Colin. That was a really interesting presentation. And look, apologies with the slides. Some of them seem to have a mind of their own with the timing, but we will make them available to participants. We'll post them with a video of a recording of this webinar, and I think we're going to make them available in the chat to participants as well. So apologies that some of them were a bit out of order with you speaking. I'd now like to move to our second speaker, Dr. Michele Barnes. Michele is a Senior Research Fellow with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies at James Cook University. She has excellence for coral reef studies at James Cook University. Her research draws on theories and methods from sociology and economics to contribute to a better understanding of the linkages between people and nature that underpin complex environmental problems. Dr. Barnes' current research uses as a network lens to understand climate change adaptation, transformation, and resilience in coastal communities, with study sites in Australia, Papua New Guinea, and Kenya. She is committed to research impact and regularly engages with policymakers and practitioners to work toward a sustainable future for both people and ecosystems. Over to you, Michele.
Thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about sort of a broad understanding of how social networks relate to resilience in the context of environmental change, which is primarily what my research focuses on. So it's not specifically about disasters, but definitely has a lot of relevance in this space. So I hope that we can sort of chat about that after as well in the Q&A. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the Bindal and Wulgarukaba peoples as traditional owners of the lands and waters where I live and work here in Townsville, and honor their elders past, present, and emerging. So as many of us are acutely aware, we live in a rapidly changing world where human societies are facing considerable risks in terms of sea level changes, disease, food security, and pretty extreme climate events. Just as an example, this is a picture of Townsville, where I live in 2019, where we had a 1 in 1,000 year flood event. The water inundated nearly the entire city, resulting in catastrophic loss of life and property. So the profound importance of ensuring that people and communities can effectively respond to these types of shocks and kind of longer term changes in general has really spurred a flurry of scholarship on the concept of resilience. So resilience can be defined in many ways. Now, within the social sciences, it's often understood as capturing how people are affected by and respond to change, generally being considered as their capacity to tolerate, absorb, cope with, and adjust to change. Now, a related kind of sort of emerging perspective stemming from the social ecological systems sciences and sort of the sustainability sciences argues that people are fundamentally embedded in the natural world, and thus resilience is actually a property sort of the linked dynamics between people and nature. So what does this mean exactly? From this perspective, environmental systems can be understood as linked social ecological systems, comprised of an ecological unit, a social unit, and the interactions between them. Right, so the idea is that ecological systems provide critical ecosystem goods and services that support human health, livelihoods, and well-being, such as food, medicines, and waste cycling, while social systems feed back on ecological systems through modifying actions like resource extraction, ecosystem management, and other sorts of actions. And really what this framework gets at is the idea that what happens in one aspect of this system is tightly linked to what happens in the other. So from this perspective, the concept of resilience describes the ability of a linked social ecological system to tolerate unknown or unforeseen shocks by absorbing, accommodating, or embracing change, or to fundamentally reorganize as a sort of in response to challenges that may be impossible to address within the current system structure. So these two concepts are increasingly being described as adaptation and transformation, right? Where adaptation sort of describes minor to moderate changes to practices or behaviors within an existing system, often taken in response to an event. So from a social perspective, this might be something like farmers diversifying their farming practices in response to declines in yield, or the construction of seawalls to deal with coastal flooding from extreme events or sea level rise. Now, transformation, on the other hand, describes sort of more fundamental changes that have the ability to create new systems or futures. So, for example, the gravity of climate impacts might result in a system no longer being able to support traditional livelihoods such as farming, causing farmers to seek out new livelihood strategies. Now, when these strategies play out at scale, they're not only going to involve new ways of using land, but might also often require institutional changes. So things like allowing new supply chains or access to new markets. So taken together, resilience from this perspective sort of offers a forward-looking vision of sustainability where people anticipate change and are better prepared for disasters and are more capable of influencing future trajectories, sort of, I guess, rather than sort of reacting to crises when it may be too late. So both adaptation and transformation require adaptive capacity among social actors and institutions in order to absorb and shape change. So adaptive capacity is often defined sort of as the conditions that enable people to anticipate and respond to change, minimize the consequences, recover, and take advantage of new opportunities. Now, as we sort of learned a little bit about in Colin's talk, social networks have sort of long been advocated as a crucial component of adaptive capacity due to their ability to facilitate learning, provide access to resources and social support, and reduce the transaction costs that are associated with coordinating responses to change. So throughout the rest of this talk, I'm going to sort of provide just a quick overview of research that really demonstrates how, or talks about how social networks relate specifically to adaptive capacity. And I'll provide some examples of recent work in this area. Okay, so work on social networks and adaptive capacity is often focused on groups or collectives, so communities or entire governance arrangements. And the emphasis here is often on the role of social networks in helping to build social capital and enable people to work together when confronted with environmental shocks or change. So broad network ideas are often emphasized in this context, such as the benefits of having some general level of connectivity to facilitate the flow of information and resources, particularly among diverse actors. So for example, between communities and local government. But there's also some drawbacks. For example, research has shown that strong clustering or network fragmentation, where you have sort of groups that are sort of separate from each other, could stall or impede collective responses to disasters and environmental change due to conflicts that can arise between groups and by causing mental lock-ins, whereby people sort of become resistant to new ideas and change that sort of go beyond what they're used to in their group. Now, more specific arguments have been made in reference to bonding and bridging network structures, which are theoretically related to ideas of bonding and bridging social capital. So bridging network structures describe relationships between diverse actors. So this would be something like that star configuration that you see there on the slide. And these relationships are argued to facilitate coordination, provide opportunities for sharing knowledge across scales, and present opportunities to bring divergent groups of actors together behind a common goal. Now, on the other hand, bonding network structures represent sort of tight coupling between similar actors. So these are these kind of close groups where a friend of my friend is usually also my friend, where you see these triangle-like structures that you see there on the slide. Now, these strong bonding networks can help to build trust, enhance tacit learning, facilitate shared negotiated agreements, and can also reduce the transaction costs that are associated with getting people to work together, all of which sort of can enable more effective responses to disasters and environmental change at that group level. Now, research in this area has also focused on the role of social networks on the adaptive capacity of individuals and households. Right, so in this line of work, broadly speaking, having ties to friends or family or being well connected or prominent in a network has been argued to be important because it can provide advantageous access to resources and of course provide social support in times of need when faced with shocks or surprises, which we definitely learned a bit more about in Colin's talk. Having ties that link disparate groups, often discussed as bridging or brokerage ties, can also be beneficial because they provide access to diverse sources of information and resources, which can facilitate innovations and also novel adaptation responses. Now, importantly, recent work has also begun to focus sort of on the role of social networks in uncovering how social reinforcement and social influence can affect people's adaptive decisions, right? So how are people being influenced by their peers and by others that they're around? Now, all of these concepts, so connectivity and brokerage and social influence, have all been linked to individual capacities to steer entire groups sort of toward or away from adaptive or transformative responses to environmental change as well, which touches on really important issues related to agency and who gets to decide what constitutes a resilient system and ultimately who such systems benefit. So building on this foundation, recent research that I've been heavily involved in has begun to disentangle how social networks more specifically relate to resilience by focusing not only on relationships between people, but also between people and nature. So this research rests on the idea that social ecological systems can be understood and explicitly modeled as multi-level social ecological networks. And what this does is it allows us to consider important relationships or interdependencies in social systems, which we talked a lot about in Colin's talk. So these are things like cooperation and communication between key individuals, communities, organizations, even nations. But it also allows us to capture key linkages in ecological systems, such as trophic food webs, larvae or seed dispersal, landscape connectivity, watershed connectivity, et cetera. And then on top of that, it allows us to capture the interactions between these, right? So things like resource extraction, ecosystem service flows, or policy and management responsibilities across different agencies. So full social ecological networks are complicated, but they can also be disassembled into smaller configurations or motifs that form the foundation for this larger network structure, right? So these sort of allow us to understand what's really driving that larger structure that you see, and it allows us to sort of drill down into the processes that are sort of going on within those relationships. Just as an example, let's focus on this triangle configuration. So here you have two social actors connected to the same ecological resource, or this could be also the same watershed or the same river, etc. And these social actors are also connected to each other, right? So this configuration represents a form of what we call closure, right? So in social networks, the theory of closure argues that tight coupling between actors facilitates trust, learning, and helps to build and establish common norms and sanctions while minimizing uncertainty. So social ecological network closure extends this coupling across the social ecological divide. Thus, the mechanisms or social processes that it might support include things like trust, a shared vision, and sustained commitments regarding common resources, such as agreeing on rules and developing conflict resolution mechanisms. Basically, all of which can help to work toward building resilience in the face of environmental change. So this configuration has been empirically tested in several notable studies at the group level. So it was first shown to be important in a forest ecosystem in Madagascar, where patches of forests have been remarkably well preserved over a substantial amount of time by local communities as they have adapted to really strong pressures on land and forest resources. Now, it was also shown to be important for supporting healthy ecosystem conditions in a comparative study of co-managed small-scale fisheries in Kenya, which have supported fishing communities in retaining their really important fishing identity and livelihoods in the face of climate shocks, as well as other drivers of change. So taken together, this research indicates that at the community or group level, these sort of closed network structures between people and the environment can support adaptation and long-term resilience. So we're also interested in how an individual's position in these complex structures might influence their ability to adapt or transform. So in a recent paper, we looked at adaptive and transformative responses to climate change impacts among Papua New Guinean households living on a highly vulnerable island in the Pacific. So we mapped their entire kind of social ecological network structure of the whole community. So what that entailed was communication and resource sharing ties between households, as well as their links to specific fish species that they were reliant on, and then trophic linkages among those fish species. And what we found was that households that had adapted to climate impacts were more likely to find themselves in what we refer to as this social ecological square, this sort of open social ecological square. Whereas households that had undertaken more transformative action were more likely to be linked to interdependent resources and this sort of ecological social triangle that we're calling here. So just to be clear, only about 50% of people overall had adapted or transformed in any way, right? So a lot of people didn't do anything, despite there being pretty significant climate impacts on the island. So we believe that both of these network configurations are basically facilitating and supporting learning. But we argue that they can support different types of learning, right? So, and then that's what's leading to these different behaviors. So the one on the left, we believe can support social learning that involves many independent resources that people are sort of sharing information about amongst themselves. And that's perhaps contributing to a broader understanding about ecological trends, which is prompting households to adapt to changing environmental conditions. Now, in contrast, results regarding this configuration on the right suggest that knowledge built through personal connections with interconnected resources may enable people to internalize ecological feedbacks, and that can sort of catalyze more transformative action in response to changes in the ecological environment. So what does all of this mean, particularly for disaster recovery and resilience? So a critical part of disaster management, I'm sure most of you are totally aware of and completely understand, is really preparing for disasters and helping people effectively respond to and recover from disasters. And of course, preventing disasters where possible. So in order to achieve this, we need to build more resilient communities and ensure that people have the capacity to act, both in preparation for and in response to crises. And what this research shows and is helping to sort of build the evidence base for is that social and social ecological networks can play a really critical role here. So with that, I will say thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to the question and answer period.
Thanks very much, Michele. That was a really fascinating presentation to see how you could draw parallels between social ecological systems and, the need to build resilience in communities. Really interesting work you've been undertaking. Look, we've got some questions already posted into our Q&A, and I'll start to work my way through them with both yourself and Colin. Thanks for coming back, Colin. If anyone else would like to start to put some questions into the chat, we've got about 15 minutes, so we'll get through as many as we can. So some questions around this issue of people who are sort of under-involved and not being involved by choice, and a question around what is the best way to engage people who, choose to not be involved. Colin, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we have to take into account and respect the choices of people and what they're doing. And I don't think it's going to be effective, much less right, to kind of overly coerce people to try to get involved in groups. People have their reasons for what they're doing. So I guess in response to that question, it's about, well, what might you do to kind of inform that choice? And there's kind of two general things you might say. One is to inform the choice. It's like, do they actually know these groups exist and near them? So there's a knowledge issue. There might be a comfort issue and an expectation issue about approaching the groups. So to whatever degree that can be addressed through understanding about how new memberships are perceived by certain groups and the rates of new memberships in groups. That is another thing that can set expectations up more positively. And then also understanding the costs involved with group membership, costs around time. That might be just how long does it take in these communities to get to a certain venue? And do you have to drive? What are the childcare costs involved as part of that? Money to literally either pay membership dues or buy a piece of equipment that kind of allows you to be a part of that group, say if it's like four-wheel driving. So there are those cost issues. So I think understanding those factors is a big aspect. Another aspect though is kind of how people perceive themselves as part of groups. So some people just don't see themselves as positively as part of a group. So there are some suggested therapies and approaches that can address when people just don't see themselves as a group person that might factor into the situation.
Thanks, Colin. And did you want to respond to that, Michele?
I think that was a really great response, and that it was probably tailored toward Colin's talk a bit more. So.
Okay, no worries. Look, it's sort of a follow-up question, and you might want to take this one as well, Colin, but how are cold communities and people with disability involved in your research? Were you able to engage those groups? Because traditionally they are a harder to engage group, both in sort of community engagement development, but also in research.
Oh, wow. Well, maybe Lisa is lurking out in the audience, so she might be able to chime in a bit better. This was a challenge in our research to reach hard to reach groups. A lot of these communities aren't very culturally and linguistically diverse, as we found. The ones we approached in the bushfires. I know that Lisa and my colleagues have worked extensively on participatory action research projects to try to reach into these communities a bit better. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm the best place to respond to this question. But I would encourage you to check out the work of Carolyn Wallace with Mary Health and Swinburne University, who's done a lot of great work with understanding how to access these hard to reach populations within the community and how best to that public agencies and other non-for-profits can actually reach into these hard to reach pockets of the community.
Thanks, Colin. And Lisa has just in fact posted to say that it was a fairly homogenous community through the Beyond Bushfires work. I can also let people know that the Brotherhood of St Lawrence did a report several years ago now on reaching the hard to reach, and I would certainly encourage people to have a look at that piece of research as well. Something that often comes up in our webinars is this impact of COVID on the building of social capital post-disasters. So normally we, have the situation where people come together physically to, have community barbecues and, events, and it does help with those sort of social connections. So how can people build bridging or bonding social capital when they've been in lockdown? Michele, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, yeah, that's an excellent question. And to be honest, I don't know that I have a great answer for it. I mean, it's a major problem. I think in general, we are social creatures by nature, and being in this sort of era where we aren't able to socially interact in person is really challenging for a lot of people in a lot of ways, which is why we're seeing, so much more mental health crises everywhere. And the idea of, how do you actually create connections when you literally cannot put people together in a room? It's a major problem. I don't know that I have a great answer for it. I do know that, some of the things that we've been trying to do in some of our field sites, which are overseas, is having people we've been trying to access people via mobile phones and trying to get people sort of stay in contact with people via mobile phones. So just give them a call every now and then try to connect people that way and just have informal chats about, what's going on in their community, how COVID is impacting them, how can they be supported, and trying to link them up with other people that way. But, it's really a stopgap at this point. It's unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for the COVID era that we're living in. I do wish it was easier, but having these sorts of events online, I mean, it's, it really is amazing that we can connect with people from all over Australia, even in through this event today. So, in some ways that is building ties, right? It's maybe not the way that we're used to, but it is, and it can help.
Thanks, Michele. Colin, did you want to respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think similar to what Michele was saying, it's not a great situation for building, what we would term as weak ties, which are these really useful, diverse ties that we have, that we can, the person I knew in school, or the person I saw talk or met at a conference. We've lost that water cooler conversation at work, those kind of tangential conversations we have where we pick up a really useful tip or bit of information. So it's not necessarily, and then on top of that, we're all stressed out, right? We're all worried about our mental health, and that's not necessarily the best mindset to be explorative and reaching out and setting up new relationships potentially. So there are a lot of challenges. I think the discussions we've had in the Melnet group center around sharing social capital. So right now, everything's kind of historical. The people you know are the people you knew 2 years ago. So if you're going to reach out and network, maybe one tip is think about who's your, talk to the people you know and see if you can kind of leverage their social capital to try to expand your links. And that's maybe the best advice of some not great options.
Thanks, Colin. Your findings, Colin, that being connected to someone who then leaves the community can actually increase the risk of depression. So it raises some concerns around the fact that, within local government, often, disaster recovery positions are funded in, short term, so they're temporary roles, 6 months, 12 months. And so, you know, communities, you know, have to tell their story again and again to different people. They've built a trust bond, then that's eroded. So the question really is around, you know, have state and federal government agencies had an opportunity to review some of the findings from your research with a view to changing some of those policy settings around, you know, longevity and sustainability of employment in those, you know, forward-facing recovery roles?
Yes, definitely. Lisa may be able to factor in more information here, but the Beyond Bushfires group has transitioned to an advisory group that includes a lot of input from local, state, and federal agency. And one of the key questions here is one of time. So what's the time frame we need to be thinking about with recovery? So much research is done in the short term recovery space, but kind of the one unique slots that Beyond Bushfires fills is this kind of medium term that's going to answer questions about, you know, sunset of government programs.
Yeah. Michele, did you want to comment on that as well? That issue of longevity of relationships at a community level?
So that is something I, you know, personally have experienced in a lot of the communities that I work in, that they are constantly talking about issues related to having sort of, I guess, parachute, you know, researchers and organizations and all sorts of other, you know, I guess, representatives that sort of pop in for a little while and then leave. And oftentimes you have all of these half-started projects or half-started, you know, strategies that never really see, I guess they never achieve what they're meant to achieve in the long run, because there's not that longevity and there's not that long-term relationship and that long-term buy-in. So I think it's a real problem. And yeah, if there are ways to, I mean, and it's tough, I think, for people that are trying to coordinate these types of programs and initiatives, because, you know, they have staff turnover and they have, you know, so they're doing the best they can in a lot of ways. But I think if there is, you know, anything that we could do just to keep that in mind and try to, you know, get people hired and get positions for people that can, you know, make a commitment in the long term with the community. And I think also there's a bit of more care that can be taken with handoffs when, you know, when there is a change in personnel, and just trying to stay committed to seeing things through would be really helpful for a lot of the communities that I've worked in.
And I think, you know, my response would be we are seeing some changes in policy settings with several jurisdictions now standing up permanent recovery agencies. I mean, QRA in Queensland's been ongoing for many years. Resilience New South Wales recently established, Bushfire Recovery Victoria, and now the NRRA coming online with a cohort of, you know, ongoing funded recovery officer positions. So I would suggest we are seeing a slight shift in policy settings around some of that, and hopefully we can draw that back to the research that was done as part of the 10 Years Beyond Bushfires work, that we are seeing a slightly different policy response. This is probably a bit hard to answer, but I'm going to, you know, a bit of a value judgment. 10 years on from the Victorian bushfires and nearly 2 years now from Black Summer, do you think communities are safer or less safe on the whole? Big question.
Oh, wow. I guess, how would you rate safety? I mean, I guess I'll kind of deflect with another question. That's a really tough question to ask. I do, you know, and you can pull out a series of anecdotal evidence about how these communities have changed. I know that, you know, personal anecdotes, my in-laws live basically in King Lake, and they see kind of the culture shift. They were very naive with respect to, you know, fire safety before, and then since then it's been a total kind of, at least in their pocket, a 180 in terms of fire safety and what goes in there. So there's a vigilance there in terms of responsible kind of behavior and responsibility towards neighbors. But how that plays out across these regions and in what ways is such a, I mean, I guess that's the long and short of it in terms of what we're trying to figure out as researchers.
Thanks, Colin. Michele, did you want to comment?
Yeah, so that's a can of worms question, I think. I think, as Colin mentioned, like in a lot of ways, there's more awareness, and, you know, there's obviously been a lot of effort that's been put into trying to make communities safer. At the same time, there's a lot of reckless policies about, building near the coast, which we know is eroding, and, other things, building in flood zones and stuff. So I think, I don't know if I have a good answer. I just know that I see both of those things happening at the same time. So perhaps we've done a lot, but there's still a lot that can be done.
Well, look, we do like to ask the challenging questions on these AIDA webinars. So thank you very much, both of you, for your presentations and your generosity with your time answering the Q&A from our participants. That's really all that we have time for today. So I'd like to thank you again for making time to speak with us today. We still have one more webinar to come as we explore more elements of the 10 Years Beyond Bushfires report in more depth. So join us on Wednesday, the 20th of October at 2 p.m. for the next webinar on children, families and schools with Lisa Gibbs, Jane Nursery and Bronwyn Spark. So that should be another interesting discussion with some terrific presenters. AIDA, we currently have an annual stakeholder survey in the market to evaluate our work over the last 12 months. So please take the time, if you have time, to fill in that survey. We're really interested to understand how you use our resources, including what's working for you and where we can improve. And you can go in the prize to win a great prize pack as well. So please, if you could complete it, we would be very grateful. We've got nearly 500 survey responses to date. So on behalf of AIDA, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We'll send you an email once the recording from today's session is live on the Knowledge Hub. And when you exit today's Zoom session, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. That's just a few questions about how valuable we found today's presentation. So thank you again. It's been a pleasure to be your host this afternoon. Until next time, stay safe and farewell.